Just one more thing we're going to get to about this score for Mark Lane's JFK film.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So let me go through that real quick. So, there's a hypothesis. I'll call it a hypothesis. It's not a theory that Paul McCartney, biological Paul McCartney, was taken out because he was going to do the soundtrack to a Mark Lane movie, and Mark Lane is best known for his JFK conspiracy work and saying that it was a government plot, and there was a whole lot more to it than just Lee Harvey Oswald. And there's a propensity out there for people to cling on to stories that make them, I guess, more comfortable or feel better as far as the how virtuous Paul McCartney was, at least in their mind, at least what they want to believe. And I'm not saying that Paul McCartney didn't have virtue. What I'm saying is nobody knows the man personally, right? You didn't grow up with him. You didn't go to lunch with him. You didn't go to school with him. You didn't hang out with him. You didn't drink beer with him. So what people have in their heads are fabricated stories and scenarios that they have created over time based upon what they want to believe. And so there's a lot of people that don't want to believe that Paul McCartney was in a mind control program, that I have suggested is very possible based upon the birdcage imagery, which is on the internet. It's easy to find. Birdcage imagery is or symbolism is Illuminati symbolism for mind control. Okay, so people don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that his death could have been a ritual sacrifice. It has to be something along the lines where he was doing something really good and then he got taken out before he can do his good deed, right? So in any case, so I want to talk a little bit about Mark Lane because people, they don't look into people is what I want to say. So Mark Lane is a controversial character. Let's just say that there's the birdcage imagery, right? So birdcage imagery is Illuminati symbolism for mind control. So let me just take you through this, Billy, real quick. So Mark Lane, his real last name is Levin. So he's Jewish. He was a Jewish lawyer who was born in 1927 and he died May 10th of 2016. In 1951, Lane established a practice with Seymour Ostro in East Harlem, that's in New York. Although Lane acquired a reputation as a, quote, defender of the poor and oppressed, Ostrow later asserted that Lane was, quote, motivated more by his ambition and quest for publicity than any dedication to a cause or concern for the interests of his clients. The partnership, meaning their law firm, dissolved in the late 1950s. So what we need to know about Mark Lane is the main protagonist involving the JFK conspiracy. So he was really front and center about the conspiracy, that it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald that acted alone, that there was an entire, cabal of conspiracists that were involved in the murder or the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Okay. So it was also at this timeline, we have to understand that the CIA coined the phrase conspiracy theorist. So the phrase conspiracy theorist goes back to the JFK assassination.
Yep.
Who was front and center with the conspiracy theory about the JFK assassination? It was Mark Lane. He was also connected into, and I'm sure a lot of people don't know this, he was connected into Jim Jones.
Oh my God.
Okay. So in 1978, Lane began to represent the People's Temple. So this is Jim Jones. And the temple leader, Jim Jones, hired Lane and Donald Freed to help make the case of what is alleged to be a grand conspiracy by intelligence agencies against the People's Temple. Here's the kicker. Lane was present in Jonestown during the evening of November 18th, 1978, and witnessed or heard part of the events, claiming at least 408 lives. So here we have Mark Lane being the front man at the front of the parade for the JFK assassination, the conspiracy, right? And I'm not saying that he was wrong, but he's controlled opposition, right? I'm going to get to this. There are other researchers that have looked into him and said that he was in military intelligence, he was with the CIA, and he was therefore controlled opposition. Lane also represented James Earl Ray, the person that is claimed to have assassinated Martin Luther King.
Really?
All right, so he's got JFK, Jonestown, and James Earl Ray, right? And he represented James Earl Ray, King's alleged assassin, before the House Select Committee on Assassinations during an inquiry in 1978. Okay, so we have this guy. He's got himself attached to very high-profile events, 2 assassinations, JFK, Martin Luther King, and then he's connected into Jim Jones. So he did 2 movies. He did Rush to Judgment and Executive Action. And he also wrote, I took a look on the internet, apparently 27 books. So he was very prolific. 2 movies, 27 books, and so on. Okay, now, I interviewed a guy going back a number of years ago, Rich Monroe, and he wrote a book about conspiracies. And during that interview, and I'll drop the link down below, and I'll give it to send it off to Billy as well, so he could put it in the description box. He worked for Mark Lane, right, and he concluded that he was controlled opposition. And I asked Rich during that interview if Lane ever discussed his movie and Paul McCartney doing the soundtrack, and Rich said no. He never heard any discussion about Mark Lane talking about Paul McCartney doing the soundtrack for his movie. Okay, so go. Let me just read to you. So somebody wrote me and was asking about this because there's a trope out there about this whole Mark Lane thing, and this is how Paul McCartney got himself in hot water.
When we talk Paul McCartney, what era is this?
This is 1966. Is I'll get to this. So in 1966 is when Mark Lane allegedly had this conversation with Paul McCartney about doing the soundtrack for his movie, and that's what I'm going to talk about now.
Because I know Paul McCartney was asking, or he was saying something about JFK, that he didn't act alone or something like that. Is that right?
That's the story, right? That's the story. The thing is, I have no knowledge of Paul McCartney in an interview discussing it.
That's true. It's just kind of hearsay.
Right?
Yeah.
And also, we have never heard Billy, as Paul McCartney, ever talk about this alleged
soundtrack,
working to this collaboration or soundtrack with Mark Lane, which I find very interesting because the JFK assassination is not something that's just, it's not a minor thing.
Yeah.
So I've never heard Paul McCartney talk about it when he was alive, biological Paul McCartney. If somebody has an interview where he does discuss it, please send it along. And I've never heard Billy ever talk about it, ever. Okay, so somebody wrote me, and this is what I wrote. So this is my take on it, because people have asked me, what do you think about this? I said, I seriously doubt the Mark Lane McCartney theory contains any truth. Lane, according to researchers like Christopher Boland, was controlled opposition. He worked for military intelligence and was a CIA operative, according to these other researchers. Many people don't know he was intertwined in the Jim Jones Jamestown massacre, which was a CIA cult endeavor. The story about JPM, or Paul McCartney's involvement in Lane's movie, comes from Lane. In his book, Citizen's Dissent, he claims to have met JPM at a cocktail party, which led to a discussion about the JFK assassination and Paul asking to read the manuscript to his movie. Yeah. After JPM allegedly read the manuscript, Lane tells us he suggested McCartney write the music score, which Paul agreed to do, But when Lane decided the film, but later on, Lane decided the film was better off with a, quote, stark and didactic vibe without music. Okay, so he meets him at a cocktail, meets Paul at a cocktail party, talks to him about the manuscript. Paul wants to read the manuscript. He reads it, gets back to him after several days, and says, yeah, I can write the score to this movie. But then Lane decides that the film is better off without music. So we have to say to ourselves, or have to ask ourselves, so hold on here. So he's got supposedly, the biggest name in entertainment at the time in 1966 to back his endeavor and to write the musical score, to put the soundtrack together. And then he decides, I'm not going to do that. So on one hand, he wants to have all his attention put on his film so that he can get his message out about the conspiracy around the JFK assassination. But he doesn't want to bring Paul McCartney's soundtrack into the movie. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
No.
And of course, this whole discussion is predicated on the fact that Paul McCartney is actually writing music, that he is actually writing music with John Lennon, which, for those of you who know my work, that wasn't happening. Because I don't believe he or John Lennon or George Harrison wrote anything between 1962 and 1966. Okay, so that's problem number one for me. So it goes on to say that I told my friend that Paul was not a songwriter, so he wasn't going to score anything himself. I believe it's a contrived storyline by Lane. Also, the book was published in 1968, 2 years after Paul was gone, which was very convenient. If Lane was a CIA operative, he would have known that Paul departed back in 1966. In other words, he knew that he had died, right, in 66. So in 1968, 2 years later, you can come out and say, I had this conversation with him.
But then again, if he says that Billy Shears is still around, surely he would say, no, we didn't.
Right. So, but we never hear Billy talk about it. I've never heard Billy talk about Mark Lane, the JFK assassination, none of that, right? So, and I am unaware of Billy as Paul ever being asked about working with Lane. You would think at some point over the timeline, Billy as Paul would have been asked about something like his involvement with the JFK conspiracy.
You would have thought.
Especially with a character like Mark Lane. And then I go on to say that last I interviewed a guy a few years back that worked with Lane. He told me that Lane was a gatekeeper. My guest also talked about Lane's weird involvement with Jonestown. I asked the guy, the person that I interviewed, which was Rich Monroe, about the McCartney story, and he said he had never heard Lane discuss any collaboration involving Paul McCartney. So I told my friend that this was my take on Mark Lane. I believe he helped to concoct a CIA conspiracy theory with as controlled opposition with JFK, and also one in a theory including one around Paul's death that has lived on for almost 60 years now. So here's another interesting thing, and I'll wrap up with this, Billy. There's two different versions of this story, believe it or not. One has Lane asking Paul about writing the score, and the other had Paul offering to write the score without Lane asking. So there's two different versions of the story out there, and I'll drop a link down below, and I'll give it to Billy on the other story, where it's Paul offering to score the soundtrack without Lane asking. In the alternate version, where Paul offers his desire to score the movie, the story has it that Lane is with Paul McCartney in, I guess, Paul McCartney's apartment, and he's playing the beginnings of a song that he was working on, and he plays it for Lane. And that song was Eleanor Rigby. Okay, so here's the problem, all right? Paul McCartney didn't write Eleanor Rigby. That song was written either by George Martin, Theodore Adorno, or some other crack ghostwriter that was on the team for writing the Beatles' music between 62, 66, and also from 66 to 1970. But in any case, I hope that made some sense. So the bottom line is that Mark Lane, he's a controversial character. There's a sketchiness about the things that he was involved in. And so the whole story, when you read about it, it seems very contrived to me. Now, did he meet Paul McCartney? Maybe he met Paul McCartney. But certainly Paul McCartney was not going to be writing a soundtrack or scoring his movie, because Paul McCartney wasn't,
So you think
wasn't a
this guy,
songwriter.
he's just put the story out there and that's it, basically. There's no substance behind it and people have latched
That's
on.
what I see. I see a story that was put out there in 1968. Paul McCartney's gone because he died in late 66. Pick your date: August, September, November. And so, who was going to argue the story? I don't know. But then again, like I said, we don't ever hear Billy, who's playing Paul McCartney, ever talk about this. So I don't know. The whole thing seems very contrived to me. And personally, I put zero stock in that explanation as to why Paul McCartney died.